Cassia, are you here?
Yes. Can you hear me? I'm assuming you can hear me? Yeah, you can hear. Okay, good. So welcome back. I'm Cassia Valentini, and I work as a researcher at the University of Edinburgh and at Speak Unique. And I am very happy to introduce today's keynote speaker, Professor István Winkler. He's currently the director of the Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience and Psychology, Research Center for Natural Sciences in Budapest, and the head of the Sound and Speech Perception Research Group. He has a PhD from the University of Helsinki on auditory sensory memory by electroencephalographic measures, and a Doctor of Science from the Hungarian Academy of Science on auditory deviance detection. He has over 250 publications, over 11,000 references. His interests are predictive processing in the auditory deviance detection, auditory scene analysis, and communication by sound, and the development of these functions in infancy. And today he'll be presenting early development of infantile communication by sound. So let's welcome our speaker. Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you for the nice introduction, and thank you for inviting me for this speech, and thanks everyone who is willing to listen to it, including perhaps people who haven't gone to a lunch break by their computer. Now, as you can see from the title, I'm going to talk about infants, pre-verbal infants, and the processes that help them in communication. Why is it important or interesting for you to listen to anything like that, except for the absolutely outside chance that you will sometimes develop some application for these infants, is that it's always interesting to see how a system has developed, where it starts from, what kind of capabilities it has initially, what it has to learn, and so on. So this is the kind of information that we are looking at here. Now, one more thing I hope you know about the Wizard of Oz, because I will have a question in the end about it. Okay, this is just an overview, and we will start with a very brief introduction of the methods that we used to be able to record something from the infants, to know what they perceive, or at least what their brain does when some auditory stimuli are arriving. What you see here is a very simple system. We have a stimulator unit, which produces sounds, which through a limiter, so that we never shout into the ears of the infants, goes finally to these attached ear couplers. And at the same time, we have electrodes attached on the scalp of the infant, and we record the electroencephalography from here. At the same time, we have the triggers from the stimulation unit to know what's happening and where. And finally, the EEG is recorded somewhere. So this is a fairly simple system. Why do we use EEG or in general brain responses? First of all, it's very difficult to get behavioral responses from young infants, and they also change a lot in time. Well, everyone who has babies knows that within the first year of life, what a baby can do changes drastically. So it's very difficult to compare across age groups with that. At the same time, the brain imaging measures are somewhat more stable. They are not fully stable either, but at least more comparable. There are various brain imaging measures that one can use. The most reliable one, and the one that we know most about it, is the electroencephalography, which is the EEG. And then you can use infrared spectroscopy and magnetic resonant imaging, functional magnetic resonance imaging. I will show maybe some data from theirs, but mainly our data will be from EEG. Now, within the EEG, there are several techniques you can apply to extract some kind of information from the EEG. The easiest and perhaps most traditional way is called the event-related potentials, ERPs. What they do is that they extract information about what is happening within the brain immediately after the stimulus has arrived. Then if you want to know a little bit more about the surroundings, then there are techniques from spectral analysis, which are less tied to the exact moment of the presentation. And finally, from longer periods, one can extract functional brain networks. Functional brain networks mainly tell about the relationship between various areas of the brain and how constant is this relationship, the phase relationship, how reliable it is. I will tell a little bit more about the ERPs because we will see so many ERPs. The event-related potentials, the basis of that is that we have the assumption that if we repeat the same situation and the same stimulus many times, there is something common that appears in all of those cases. And what we try to do is to extract this. Now, same can mean a lot of different things. Identical is usually when we use it in acoustics, but sometimes this is categorical. This is same, for example, presenting nouns as opposed to adjectives or something like that, or simply similar when you present stimuli that are somewhat similar to each other, and you then, for example, contrast them to something that is very much dissimilar. Now, repeating the stimulus, this is the, let's say, downside of this technique. At a minimum, you will need about 50 times the repeat, but in more cases, when the signal to noise ratio is not as good, it should go over 100 or even 150. Now, there are some assumptions that you have to make to extract that information. You make assumptions about the noise. The easiest thing that you can do is you assume that the noise is independent of your signal and it's stationary. Of course, if you expect that, then you can use some very simple technique like simply averaging with respect to the onset time, the various trials, and then you can show that it reduces the noise. Now, these assumptions are usually not exactly true, like stationary is a very strong thing to say about the human brain. And one can say it's more or less holds within a certain period of time. The same is true about the independence. It's not always completely independent, your signal, from what else is happening in the brain. But in practice, what we see is that more or less there is something that is characteristic to certain stimuli or situations, and therefore we can extract information that way. There are more complex models when you know, for example, that there is something that is happening there, which would directly opposite to one of your assumptions. Now here I will show one specific component which is very often used in these kinds of situations, because it's good for determining whether the infant was able to discriminate two sounds, and also whether there was something he or she could extract from the regular sequence. This is called the mismatch negativity in adults and mismatch response in infants, because the response is not necessarily negative in the infants. The mismatch response is elicited by sounds that somehow violate some preceding regularity, acoustic regularity. So what we see here in this example is that, for example, this was presented to adults. There are footsteps going from left to right in the room, and most of them are very similar. That is, like they would fit into a normal, regular walking sounds. But then there is one, here it is shown by white, which, as if the person who was walking stepped onto a different surface, like crushed glass. It was what we used. And so this kind of it differs very much from the previous sounds, and you would expect some kind of response that tells that it's different. But what is special about this mismatch response is that you really need the regularity to have this. So if you, for example, simply turn the footsteps around, you play it in the reverse order, in which case, of course, the footsteps are going from right to left, but you have the same order of them. That means that what was the 10th footstep in the original sequence becomes the second one in the new sequence, then you don't get this response because there was no regularity precedingly set up. So one sound does not set up a regularity and you cannot violate it. It could have been a regularity like every second footstep is this way and every second is another way. Okay, so this is very special to this response, and that's why it is so useful, because it can tell about two different things. First, if you see an MMR, then you will know that the sound that elicited it could be discriminated from the regular sounds. And if you turn it around, you know that there was some regularity in the system. Something from the preceding sounds was memorized, extracted, and held in memory. And this new sound, the different sound, therefore mismatched it. That's why it's called the mismatch negativity. Now, as it looks here on panel C, you can see that this is a response that if at 0 is the onset time of the footsteps, which comes about between 100 and 200 milliseconds. And as I said, in adults, the difference between the sound and its control, which in this case is the same sound, but in a different position of the sequence, is usually negative, frontally at least. Now, in infants, this is not true. It's not necessarily negative. It can come also a little later and so on. But the point is that the response characterizes something that there was a regularity, and what we see now, or what we encounter now, is different from that. Okay, with this weaponry, now we start to look at what we learned about the infants. The first thing will be what I would call the scarecrow view. I call it scarecrow because it is something that nobody holds really for the last 30 years. But indeed, before 30 years, this was about the notion scientists had about how infants perceive in general. And the first thing we'll talk about is pitch discrimination. Okay, I know that you probably cannot read ERP, so you will just have to believe me when I tell what you see on this figure. And that is that with moderate, that means low amount of deviation from a repeating sound, if the pitch is only different about, let's say, 5 to 10%, you don't get a reliable response except for in the low ranges of the spectra. Whereas to get a reliable response everywhere, anywhere in the spectrum, you have to do about 20% difference. Now, 20% is really a lot. So for comparison, here is the thresholds of pitch discrimination thresholds at different ages. And you can see that it has a very long developmental trajectory. So the final 2.5% amount that is characterizing adults is reached really very late. It's kind of in teenager time. Well, you probably, if you have children of about 5, 6, 7 years old, then you know how their singing tells you that they don't really hear the difference between kind of pitches. So this is not something in which neonates are good. Another thing they are not very good at is gap detection. Gap detection is a very simple paradigm. You present two tones with a certain gap between, and you try to get what is the minimal amount of gap that someone will detect. Now, as you can see here on this part of the figure, adults usually detect about 20 milliseconds gaps. So that they are already good at 20 milliseconds. The D prime tells you how well they could discriminate the 20% from, let's say, 0 or something like that. Now, as opposed to that, infants are very bad, even at, let's say, 50 milliseconds. They don't produce very good discrimination. And I could tell you a number of more simple features in which the discrimination of which infants are rather bad. So like spatial discrimination, intensity discrimination, all of them are pretty bad. So at that point, and this is what has been known for a very long time, that feature resolution is typically much cruder in young infants than in adults. And for a long time, the view was that, okay, so all is needed is some maturation, for example, myelination to complete and so on. If that would be the case, then one would expect that the infants are equally bad in capabilities for detecting complex sound features. But as I will show you very soon, this is not the case. So our next view will be the, let's say, the Tinman view. The Tinman view, because it's a rather mechanistic view of the infant auditory system, but at least it tells about capabilities that are somewhat more complex than the previous one. For example, this is a very simple thing, the so-called missing fundamental pitch. You probably all know that what you hear as pitch is the highest denominator, common denominator of all the frequencies that you have in a harmonic structure. And therefore, you can create sounds, harmonic structures, in which the lowest harmonic that you put in is always higher than the previous sound, but in some cases, the actual pitch goes down because the highest denominator will be lower than the previous one, okay? This is a rather simple thing to do. And as you can see here, already 4 months on, old infants are pretty good at that. They can discriminate very well this change in the tone pairs, in which usually the pitch goes up, but in a few cases the pitch goes down, and at the same time the lowest harmonic that is used is always going up. Okay, but they can do, I would say, almost miracles with pitch structure. These are chords. And if you, for example, make a major chord your regular sound, that is, you repeat major chords many times, then you can see that here, well, you probably cannot see, but at least I can point you out that, for example, a minor chord can be detected. So if there are many major chords and between them one minor chord, then even newborn infants can detect this. They can also detect, of course, what we call dissonant sounds, which do not make a regular chord, but they do not detect an inverted major chord, which is of the same type. Okay, so that's already not very trivial. But there are still many, many more features that are much more complex than the ones that I've been talking about initially, and I will go through a few of these. For example, the next one is related to voice. That is, one quality of voice is that we have a kind of impression about the size of the resonator. So like, for example, usually a large person is speaking with a much larger resonator, and you can, just hearing his voice, you can hear that he is a larger person than, for example, a smaller person. It does not depend on the actual pitch. It's a different aspect of the sound. So I will show you a paradigm that was based. Where is page up? Okay. Okay. So if this was the sequence, then already newborn infants are able to discriminate this. One may even think about it that this is evolutionarily important because a larger object or animal could be more dangerous. Another voice-related feature is that it's very easy for infants to make themselves familiar with some voice. For example, the mother's voice is always usually familiar, and they can discriminate it from the voice of a similar pitch but other female. Then there are features that are require more than one sound. So that if there is a sound sequence, then the sound sequence may have a temporal structure, and infants are sensitive to this temporal structure. So here is a very, very simple type of regularity. So the first, what we call the random sequence, the majority, 80% of the sounds are one type, and 20% randomly appearing other sounds are mixed into that. Now, what you would expect is that this would elicit this kind of discriminative response. But what happens if you simply make it regular, having the same amount of different sounds, just by making every fifth sound being the different one? Of course, if you listen to it, you will hear it. So I make a short sample each. It's at random. Okay. And this will be the regular. So I guess everybody heard that the second one was regular. And what happens is that also the newborn infants hear that. So what you see here is that in the random case, they elicit this type of discriminative response, whereas in what we call the group or regular case, they do not. If you go even one step further, a beat in music is something that is part of a larger structure, and you have to decode the structure to get the rhythm. Now, what we played with the simplest part of that is that simply there is a regular beat, even though everything varies. And what we did is that occasionally we omitted the upbeat or downbeat sound. And we controlled that omitting sounds from other positions or making this omitted version the regular sound, whereas the other ones became the irregular ones. This is how it sounded. Okay, I guess everybody hears when we omit the downbeat sound, because it feels like syncopated. So if you think in musical terms, this is a sort of very rude syncopation. And it seems that this elicits this kind of discriminative response, whereas if you omit from, was an 8 position beat, if you omit from positions which are not emphasized within that beat, these are the even positions, then you don't get this kind of response. Now, what that means is that the newborn infant already gets some sense of this complex rhythm. We do not want to claim that he analyzes as well as, let's say, a musician would, which is at the top of this, but there are certain things that he gets out of that. And to go to the final one of this session, we'll talk about auditive stream segregation. Now, I don't know if you call it exactly the same. This is the psychologist's term for that, but it's simply source separation. So if there are multiple sources active at the same time in the environment, then of course we can listen to them usually separately. That is, we can attend to one and disregard the other one. So like, for example, if you are conducting a discussion with someone on the street, you can select his voice out of the many noises that occur on the street. So this is called, in the psychologist terminology, auditory stream segregation. Okay, there are two types of major cues for auditory stream segregation. One of them we call the concurrent cues. Concurrent cues are something that you don't have to have any history with the sound, and just by hearing it once, you immediately hear that it's one sound or two sounds. So this is, for example, one example of that is a mistuned partial. So if you mistune a partial from a harmonic series, which you present at the same time, then you will hear two sounds. What was left of the rest, which sounds very similar to the original one, with only a slight change in timbre, and then you hear out that partial which was mistuned. So this is how it sounds. This is an in-tune sound, so that's one sound. Okay, and if we mistune one partial by 8%, you can hear that there are two sounds at the same time. Now, if you want to make this impression even stronger, one of the other cues that is very immediate and helps you to segregate sounds is if sounds are not starting at the same time, because you expect that what belongs together is starting at the same time. So you can add on top of the mistuning that you start the sound somewhat later. And this is how it will sound. So it doesn't only mistune, but the mistuned partial even starts a little later, and it makes the impression even clearer that these are two sounds. And what we see is that already newborn infants elicit some response already to the mistuning, and even much larger response to the different onset times. Okay, so that's something that they can do. But they can do even more complex things. The other type of cues of stream segregation are so-called sequential cues. Sequential cues are based on somehow the history of a sound. So like, for example, you hear a melody and you can continue it, you know what it fits there, and you wouldn't, for example, put there something that really mismatches it. And one very simple way to test that is that when sounds are separated by a relatively large pitch distance, then you will hear them as two different sounds, two different streams of sounds. I will show you not this example, which we have done in infants, because that's rather boring, but for you to get the gist of it, I will hide the tune this way, and then get the sounds that are initially preventing you from hearing the tune farther and farther, and at some point you will hear it. So now you will hear it, but a little bit larger distance. Was there anyone who already heard the tune? Now there are some people. When we get it very far, now of course everybody hears the tune separately. Oh, there was an even higher one. But one can learn these things because I already detect the tune on the second one. So we did almost exactly that. So we had an initial simple sequence in which there were one sound repeated and there were sometimes deviants. The deviants were simply a little louder or softer than these sounds. And then between each of the consecutive pairs, we put in 2 extra sounds. These extra sounds were just random sounds, and initially they varied in the same range where our stimuli were. But then in another version, we simply just removed them. These were the same amount and same relationship between the sounds was there, except that there was a very large frequency difference. And what you can see here, that both infants and adults are, of course, they get a mismatch negativity to the initial one, which was simply the sequence. When you mix them together in the same frequency range, neither of them gets anything. And finally, if you remove them, then you get back this kind of discriminative response. Okay, so what we can say is that newborn infants are already able to segregate sounds rather similarly to adults. Okay, so here's a summary from the Tinman view. In the past 30 years, we have learned that the infants are not born into a chaotic worlds of sights and sound. They are pretty competent perceivers. And in terms of the algorithms for extracting patterns, trends, higher features, they're not so far behind adults. But what is the purpose of that? What advantage does this carry for human infants that they are so prepared for this, whereas they are so bad, for example, in pitch discrimination? And this will be our third, somewhat shorter part, which is the lion's view. So that's a full organism now, even if it's not human yet, in which I will show a few things. The first of them is that infants prefer speech. So they prefer speech to similarly complex sounds. If they can select, then they will listen to speech. And also that they are able to discriminate speech from, for example, from backward speech, which is spectrally rather similar, but it's not meaningful. But even more importantly, infants are able to detect prosody. So if you have sentences and then you take out, for example, the F0 and therefore it becomes flattened, then infants, especially on the right side of the brain, which is where it should be, they are able to discriminate the two. Now, this was one study which was done by near-infrared spectroscopy. Okay, what is it good for? Our theory is that this is good for communication. And here's, for example, one important thing in communication. Infants react differently to infant-directed speech than to adult-directed speech. So infant-directed speech is the mode of speech like you talk to an infant, usually making much larger frequency shifts and slowing down the words and so on. And this is an ERP study which shows that indeed the two are different if you use simply one word and you compare between them. But if you use whole speech, then you would rather want to use a different technique, which I also talked about in the beginning, extracting functional networks. And from those, you can see that there are certain, the analysis in this case is based on some topological features of the networks that we got. So we do a kind of a minimum spanning tree on the network, and from the minimum spanning tree, you can extract certain features, some of which tell about how hierarchical this network is, others, how many leaves are there, how many end nodes are there, and so on. And for some of these features, the infant brain already shows that it's very different for it, the infant-directed and the adult-directed speech. Now, for example, here is a use of that. these researchers made a very, very simple test. The infant sitting in his mother's lap, was watching the experimenter who was sitting in front of her. And the experimenter greeted this infant, but it could greet it in two different ways. In one, it was either making eye contact or not making eye contact with the infant. And in the other experiment, it was either speaking to the infant with infant-directed speech or adult-directed speech. Now, once this greeting has been done, so there are altogether 2 times 2 conditions here, then the experimenter looked at one of the toys that was in front of her, either on the left or on the right. And what these experiments looked at, how many times does the baby look at the toy that the experimenter designated with his or her vision. And it looks that whenever the experimenter makes eye contact or greets the infant in infant-directed mode, then there are much, much more and far above the chance level looking at the toy that the experimenter looked at. So that's kind of how to direct the attention of the infant. And here is some, this is a frequency spectral analysis, which also shows that the 2 modes are very different in the brain as well. So there are large differences between the one when the experimenter did not look at the baby and when it looked. Okay, so with a little bit of summary about communication, we'll look at a few things that are necessary for communication and look at how the infants can solve it. So the first thing is that usually there are multiple sources in the environment, and we have seen that infants can segregate different sources which are active at the same time. Second thing is one needs to identify the source, what it is. Is it a danger to me, or is it something that I should do something with? And yes, newborns are sensitive to various timbre features, which are the most characteristics in terms of voice of the identity of the speaker or the source of the sound. Then what you would think about, what type of message has arrived? Is it something that is meaningful, or is it something that's just a noise? And we have seen that infants detect speech and process it differently from non-speech. The next question, is the message directed at us? Is it relevant for us? Yes, infants can detect what I would call the ostensive communication, which is what we have just seen in the previous slide. That is when it's infant-directed speech, or when somebody is looking at me, so it's for me, this message is for me. Does the message require an answer? Do I have to do something? Newborn babies process melodic contour. They process structure and stress pattern. So these are important signs within a sentence of, is it a question? Is it something that I need to do something about it? And finally, how do they are able to convey their answer to the partner? Well, they can analyze rhythm, so they know when to speak. In the next slide, and I will show you just putting it all together, an example. A Japanese father speaking with his pre-verbal infant. So the infant doesn't speak. This is not stereo now. We hear the infant, but we don't hear the father. I'm sorry, I don't think that it's worse than, of course, listening to it. But what you can imagine, there was kind of a dialogue. So the father said something and the infant was making sounds. Sometimes the sounds that he made was not even with his mouth, but like rattling something. But this is the kind of the roots of a dialogue. Okay, So the summary from the lion's view, that human sound perception appears to be geared towards communication. Why is it so important? It is so important for humans because this is the most important means of learning, developing cognition. Now, if you think about evolution, for example, a zebra is born, it stands up and starts to follow the herd. Now, the zebra has to have a very good perceptual abilities. Otherwise, it wouldn't be able to move. This is the advantage of the zebra. In contrast, human infants are pretty bad in the hearing, as we have seen. But human infants are more or less helpless for a long, long period of time. So what they need to do is not about how to, for example, follow something, get away from possible dangers. What they need to do is learn from their mother, learn from the adults in general, learn from others. And for that, they need communication. So the advantage that we get as opposed to the zebra, that whereas the zebra's perceptual system is rather fixed, there's not much to learn there because it needs to be able to function right from the beginning, but there will not be much change. In comparison, the human perceptual system has to learn a lot, but then it will be much more flexible, better adapted to the environment. Okay, if still bear with me, I will tell very shortly where it can go to, but this is rather outside our topic. So let's say we turn to now we find Dorothy. What is the, where does it go to? What kind of things we can do with communication? For example, we can make a theory of mind. Theory of mind is, in the psychologist term, what it means that I have some kind of model of you, that you are rather similar to me, and you know certain things. I might even know what you know, and you don't know certain things. I ascribe you intentions and see how you work with those. So this is, for example, a very simple experiment in which the researchers simply contrasted small videos in which action was completed or not. And there was a big difference in the brain, in the infant brain, whether it was a completed action or not. Okay, so there are many, many things, and that would needs probably more than 2 or 3 studies. So let's just conclude a little bit. Where does it go, really, the whole thing? So what follows from here? Well, I just said that in the most important things, infants know almost as much as adults. So here comes the Wizard of Oz, the adult. And we know that these are just tricks. There is not much difference. Of course, there might be a little bit of learning there, especially statistical learning, which is so well known from the speech literature. And here is, for example, one example which shows that if you make out word-like things, which means that the same 3 syllables are always following each other, then come another word, 3 syllables which always are grouped together, then there is a big difference within the syllable and between syllables, which is where the transitional probabilities change. So with that, I thank you for listening to me for so long. And here comes the question for those who know the old Wizard of Oz. Where does Linda hail from? Do you know? Anybody? But it's from the Norse. Okay, thanks a lot.
Thank you very much for the talk. It was really interesting. If people want to write questions or let me know if you want to have any questions, but I'm checking here the chat, and Felipe has a question. So if you ask a random adult to recognize a chord as a minor or a major, they usually don't recognize them, at least if they are played in isolation. How do you explain that infants can discriminate?
The discrimination is not the same as identification. So you can tell about many things that they are different, especially if they appear, one of them is regular, the other one appears just from time to time, without being able to tell what is what. So in a sense, adults are also not very bad in, if you present a series of, let's say, major chords, and then within them a minor chord, then they will recognize that it's different. Without a musician, of course, you give him one chord and he will tell you whether it's major or minor. That's much, much more than being able to tell within a series of major chords that this is not one of them. This somehow differs from it.
Do we have any questions in the room?
I have a question, yes. So we have seen in the presentation that infants are good at certain things that are kind of surprising, and I assume they were Hungarian infants. So the question is whether it depends on, I don't know, the culture, the country, anything like that, or all children in the world, all infants in the world, they are similar.
All infants in the world are similar, and not all of these studies were in Hungary. Some of them, of course, those that we have conducted in Budapest, they were mostly on Hungarians. But I think I have shown you some studies within that set, which were from other countries, and many of the things that someone else did in some other country have been repeated, or at least some variants of it done in another country. So no, there are not so many culture-dependent things. One that is really interesting is crying. Babies cry in their mother tongue. So a French, the kind of the prosody, crying is not different from speaking very much. Crying is basically speech, like in the way it's produced. And for example, a comparison between French and I think Italian infants in their first few days of life showed that their rhythm and the prosody in general is different. So that's something that we learn in even already in the womb, and that makes it culturally different in a way. But this is simply learning. You can learn also other things in the womb. There was one very nice experiment in which mothers got the, pregnant mothers got the task that they should listen to every day. They should listen to about 10 minutes of African drums in Finland. But that's not something that usually is done by people. And then when the babies were born, those babies whose mothers listened to the African drums gave different responses to these drums than those babies whose mothers did not listen to these kinds of drums. So yes, we do learn some things in even in the womb, and one of them is some kind of let's say some prosodic features of our mother tongue.
Oh, I have a lot of questions here now. I think so. The first one is from Sebastian, which I think you kind of already answered, which is about prenatal abilities on identifying speech. If you want to say something else on that. So do we have any idea of how fetuses are identifying speech?
What does it mean, how?
Yeah.
So if it would require what are the neurophysiological mechanisms of identifying speech, I don't know the answer. I don't think anybody knows the answer. But there are basically two schools of thinking about speech perception in psychology. One of them says that we have specific algorithms that are geared towards understanding speech. And some researchers try to find similar mechanisms for their own species in monkeys, in other animals, that they would be good at the calls of their own species. Then there is the other school, which basically says that the speech processing is something that is put on top of regular acoustic or auditory processing. And there are some stuff that looks like it goes exactly that way. So I don't know the answer to this question. What is it that makes infants really identify speech, and whether they identify it initially as speech or not? Even in that, I'm not sure. Maybe it's the reason they start to prefer it is simply because they hear it from the caretakers, and it kind of becomes associated with being taken care of. So the answer is I don't know. I can tell it in minutes.
So the next question is from Lovisa, and she's asking if there's any findings that if an infant mainly hears adult-directed speech rather than mainly infant-directed speech, that their cognitive development is slower or halted in any fashion?
At least to that, there is a clear answer, no. There is no definite disadvantage of not speaking motherese or infant-directed speech. There are cultures where there is no infant-directed speech, not too many. So at one, let's say, on one side, there should be some advantage in using infant-directed speech because it's so widespread among so many cultures. So they actually, the majority of the cultures have infant-directed speech. But on the other hand, it's not something that is necessary for either speech perception or cognitive development, because we know that there are cultures where it's not used and there is no deficit of intelligence or whatever generally in those cultures.
So the next question is from Simon. And does the development of infant sound perception tell us anything about our perception, how our perception degrades later in life?
Yes and no. The no part, it's obviously it's not a mirror process. So it's not like that we go up for a while and then we decrease the same time. And that is because there are many specific things which are related to development, which underlie some parts of the getting better in sound perception. So like, for example, what I told, myelination is certainly happening, and it helps the whole brain to work. And there is no demyelination in aging and stuff like that. But on the other hand, in general, it is true that capabilities that are let's say, acquired later in life, usually past infancy, are easier to lose, that they are not so, let's say, hardwired as some others. So, like, for example, if you think about the separating different objects, that's a very basic capability. Now, we'll tell the example about vision, but it's generally speaking the same in audition. So if someone was congenitally blind and due to some operation, they restored his sight to some degree, it's certainly that he will not see the word as we do see, especially if it happens, let's say, even in adulthood. But one thing that already this person is able to see, and that's figure ground, the separation of the what's in front and what is a background. And it is slightly similar in the auditory modality, that there are certain capabilities that we do not lose as such. It might be worse in that because of other types of distortions or lower frequency resolution and whatever peripheral problems can occur. But in principle, we are able to, and for example, that would be one of the aims of the hearing aid industry, is to somehow boost this ability, because that is something that is a problem in the elderly, that when the peripheral system is getting worse, then one of the things that they first lose is the ability to be able to listen to someone in a noisy environment. So whereas if there is one person and complete silence, they are still okay. But let's say in a cafeteria or sitting by the family table, where usually more than one people speak at the same time, they have problems. And that is something that some people say that the aim is really to somehow restore the signal, the auditory nerve, because the brain itself would be capable to do that still. Okay, so yes and no, as usual.
We have another question from Ayushi. So the discussion is about perception of timing in MS, voice onset time, which differences voicelessness has different boundaries in different languages. So compare Thai versus English. Do you expect acquisition of these contrasts at different times?
Now, actually, what happens voices at time is something that has been studied quite a lot. Because, like, for example, the retroflex D is something that Europeans don't hear at all. And what happens is very interesting. Initially, the capability is there. So if someone who is a European in terms of genetics would be raised in India, then the person would be perfectly able to understand and discriminate these voice onset times. But there's a lot of capability that is lost actually during development. Sometimes the getting in front is not about getting better discrimination. Sometimes it's getting worse. So, like, for example, if you think about, you can discriminate very many different phonemes, many more than your language uses. Now, if you retain that, then that ability, that would actually be disturbing in your own language, because in some languages, that same, for example, a vowel is already discriminated from a part of something that in your language as a whole. And that is actually what is happening to the voice onset time as well. So there is the initial ability, which we lose. The interesting part that, unlike the others, which one can actually retrain after a while. This is not possible to retrain because it's lost at a very low level. So actually, it's lost in the somewhere in the midbrain level, and that part I don't know why it's lost there. Whereas most of the things which we lose discrimination is lost in the cortex. But voice onset time is something that the lower part of the auditory system, central auditory system, is most sensitive to, and therefore probably it's logical that it's lost there. So the timing things, the cortex is much slower than the lower parts of the brain, and probably it has much more accuracy. So, like, for example, it's not the cortex that will tell you the interoral time difference. The cortex will never be able to tell it. It needs, it has to be handled before that. So that would be my guess, that the voice onset time is also something that the cortex would not be so sensitive to, and therefore it's handled before the sound reaches, or the sound information rather reaches the cortex, and then when it's lost, it cannot be retrained. Anything else?
Anything else? Anyone has any other questions? I think we're in a good time, so we can. Anyone there in the room? Sorry, I cannot see the audience there. Okay, there's someone.
I have a very practical question. How can you get test subjects? Because we know that even with adults, it's a problem, and also to get reasonable evaluation.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's rather easy. First of all, our newborn infant experiments are done in the hospital before the infants leave the hospital. That doesn't mean that any of the infants can be tested, but at least we have some time with the mother and try to convince her. And we also have the medical doctors on our side who will tell that this is really carries no risk, this kind of thing, and that if possible, they should give this to science. Now, it's much more difficult to get, let's say, 3-4 months old infants and so on, and they would come to our lab, of course, and not to the hospital. And we advertise a lot. We do a lot of, let's say, public relation work to get more people. It's not very simple, especially not simple to make follow-up experiments, which means that if you want to track the same infant for a longer period of time, that means that they have to come back again and again and again. So it's quite usual to have a 40-50% of people lost during the this period. Like, let's say if you want to do it for a year, just okay, but we do get. Thank you.
Thank you for the talk, and just one more chance for anyone here to ask a question or for the online participants. Okay, then thank you very much for everyone. And please, besides having your lunch, don't forget to go to the spatial chat. And also for those who are here, very soon we would like to ask everyone to collect for a photograph, and that's will be done by Peter Nagy. So just keep the interactions. I congratulate to the team who are here that like the welcome party was, I think, was quite successful, because even at 9 p.m. there were some people chatting. And so I wish the same for the evening, and also for the online participants. Okay, so use the tools. Thank you very much for the talk again to István.